Welcome to episode 1 of the Hate Meditations podcast. For any regular listeners of Necropolis, this will be a continuation of the recent trajectory of that podcast. We'll be doing some random roundtable discussions on a range of different topics, hopefully. Maybe pepper in some interviews if we can, and if we get bored, we might do the odd tier list as well. Jason will be taking Necropolis back to its roots, which is just like a purely interview podcast with various interesting characters from across extreme metal. And when I can, I'll be joining him as a co-host on that when time allows. And I'll continue to host the new episodes of Necropolis on the Hate Meditations YouTube channel. And Jason has kindly agreed to host new episodes of this Hate Meditations podcast on his Necropolis Spotify channel. So everything will be in the same place, pretty much. You won't have to go to different platforms to find new episodes of any of this stuff. And for anyone new here, to which none of that made any sense whatsoever, this will hopefully be a podcast featuring a rolling cast of semi-regular characters discussing various topics in extreme metal that we find interesting. And if you do have any suggestions, I will actually read them in the comments, which isn't always the case. But we can't promise to cover everything. Some stuff we won't have time for, some stuff we might not know enough about, but we will try and sort of take in whatever suggestions you might have if they take our fancy. I am very happy to be joined by Necropolis regular at this point, Joseph April. So yeah, thank you for coming along with us today.
Of course. Hi, everyone out there.
And I'm also very happy to be joined by Belisario of the El Negro Metal website, which is an excellent Spanish language website on extreme metal and other topics. Runs on a very similar track to Hate Meditations, but he does cover quite a lot of stuff that I've missed. So it is worth checking out, even if you don't speak Spanish, which I don't, and you have to run it through translator. There's still a lot of interesting thoughts on there. So very happy to have you on as well.
Happy to be here too.
Excellent. And Tyler was hopefully going to be joining us today, but he seems to be unavailable at the moment. But if he can jump on at some point, then he will. And hopefully he'll be with us for future episodes as well. Cool. So I think that's all of the admin shit out of the way. So let's get into it. Basically, I've gone with a very generic topic today, which is Swedish death metal. And I've noticed some people have already commented saying they want us to go into slightly more obscure topics. But I thought for a first episode, a bit like when you're meeting new people, you do the small talk, you do the icebreaker. So I thought I'd start on familiar territory, and hopefully episodes further down the line will go a bit more wacky, a bit more deep dive into some more obscure topics. And also, we did a piece on the Floridian death metal scene last year that went down very well and turned out to be a really enjoyable discussion. So I thought this would be a nice companion piece to that as well. We don't really do comprehensive histories. This won't be a blow-by-blow account of the Swedish scene. And we're not going to be overly bothered with loads and loads of trivia, although I'm sure Joseph will drop some facts in here and there because he always does. He's got quite a lot of good anecdotes and little tidbits that he always peppers in. But yeah, it'll just be a loose chat about our thoughts on Swedish death metal, probably some tangents. And yeah, if you don't like the style or what we're talking about, then don't switch off. Just tell us in the comments, ideally after only 5 minutes of listening to what we're saying. And if you could tell us in the strongest terms possible, that would be really, really great. Thanks. So, on to the meat. Swedish death metal. Oh, I should say I've opened a bottle of Rioja as well to mark the occasion. I'm not on the beers today.
Nice.
Swedish death metal is it's very diffuse. So I don't think there's any tidy way for us to kind of cover this off. I kind of, in preparation for this, I've listed like a big chunk of bands, actually shitloads, and that wasn't even covering a fraction of the bands that I could find on Metal Archives. And it was trying to categorize them was the really difficult part, because you have like one end of it, which is like the core iconic Swedish sound with bands like Dismember, Entombed, Carnage, Grave, Unleashed, who are known as like the backbone of the Swedish style. And they're known as being very sort of kind of primitive, because they derive a lot from the D-beat, the Swedish D-beat scene. They kind of mangle that with a sort of pronounced heavy metal influence, and they are pretty primitive compared to what some of the bands in Tampa were doing around the same time in the late 80s, early 90s. But then you also have all these weird outliers. You've obviously got the early Melodeath kind of scene taking shape alongside them in Gothenburg, with At the Gates and stuff like that. But then you've got a very kind of close connection with what I would say is the Peaceville Free in the UK. Swedish death metal does lean into the goth and the romantic side quite a bit. You've also got a lot of crossover with black metal as well, with bands like Dissection having an obvious kind of lineage in Swedish death metal, and things like Necrophobic and Dawn and Dissection and things like that. So it's a really messy topic, but I think we kind of do have to start. I said we weren't going to do a chronological history, but we do kind of have to start roughly at the beginning, which is going back to those iconic Swedish bands and their sort of early incarnations in stuff like Grotesque and Nihilist and Merciless and things like that, which really were kind of offshoots of the Swedish D-beat scene. But going back even earlier, I guess you could discuss bands like Bathory, who are very, very important for putting Sweden on the map as far as extreme metal is concerned, and the Scandinavian Metal Attack compilation and stuff. And these early kind of Swedish death metal bands amalgamating these more explicitly heavy metal influences with the really, really pronounced punk side of it as well. So yeah, I guess we'll start there in terms of like the early Merciless and Nihilist stuff. It's still very kind of rooted in a bit of thrash, obviously a lot of D-beat, not much in the way of kind of long form or narrative structures going on in a way that someone like Morbid Angel was doing at the time. But it still managed to kind of convey a very, very dark, very, very kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It's a kind of macabre atmosphere, as particularly on the stuff like Grotesque and Merciless as well. Merciless obviously being famous for being one of the first bands to sign to Euronymous' label, Death Like Silence as well, with their first album. So yeah, Joseph, have you got any thoughts on like the very early scene? Or actually, if you just want to say like what are your favorite things about Swedish death metal, we could keep it really generic if you like.
I mean, we can touch on the early stuff. I particularly like Merciless. It's interesting because they're definitely a band that doesn't jump out when people get introduced to Swedish death metal, even usually at like the second level. Like if someone gets in through In Flames and Dark Tranquility, and then they're like, oh, then discover stuff like Grave and Unleashed. It's usually another step or two till they discover like Merciless. The early scene is interesting because clearly, and certainly in the interviews, you can see that the hardcore punk scene, especially I think the British punk and not a huge scene, but what there was of the Swedish hardcore punk scene was such a huge influence on people like Nicky Anderson of Nihilist and then later Entombed. And that permeated especially at the early Stockholm scene. But at the same time, the 80s with extreme metal in general is this weird magical era where a lot of very clear genre classification, which would happen in the 90s and 2000s, hadn't happened yet. So like some of Nihilist and certainly of Merciless, I think you can hear a blackened edge. You can hear a bit of Bathory to it, which certainly makes sense since for that region of the world, Bathory was really the beginning of everything. So, and there's such crossover because, like you mentioned, Merciless was signed to Death Like Silence, so you have that. You have the fact that LG Petrov was in Morbid, was the original drummer in that band, which was the band, which a very primitive Black Death kind of sound. And then, of course, Dead was later famous in Mayhem, came from Morbid. And interestingly enough, that band's recently kind of been resurrected with the surviving members, and I've been very jealous of the few shows that have been happening with that. But yeah, if you go back in time and you look at the 80s, where you got bands like Merciless and then Nihilist just in their demo stage, it's a very interesting mix of things, of like the hardcore punk, especially with the British focus on stuff like GBH and Discharge, and the crust stuff, tied together with some of what's happening in the American scene. I think probably some of the demos in early recordings of Death and Autopsy in particular. And then, the nasal or, upcoming black metal, especially with Bathory. So it's an interesting mix.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, I think Thomas Lindberg of At the Gates designed the Dark Throne logo as well, and this was at the time when Dark Throne was still very much a death metal band, which sort of furthering the crossover between the two nations. And it was only really when Euronymous started becoming fixated on black metal as a sort of rallying cry more than it was just a slightly different subgenre of the, like, extreme metal of the 80s, that there was a really serious kind of not just separation between the two as far as genre is concerned, but antagonism as well. But yeah, you kind of get that, especially with the first Merciless album, that is early death metal in kind, but spiritually it has a lot to say to black metal as well. And yeah, as you said, it's that lawless kind of churn of different styles going on that kind of, and you get that in listening to the early material of these Swedish bands. There's a bit more sort of freedom and just kind of trying to mimic their influences, but in the end almost accidentally kind of stumbling upon their own style in a lot of ways. Belisario, do you have any thoughts on these like early incarnations?
Well, starting from the beginning, I would say that for me, this is my opinion, I don't know if you agree, but it's quite clear to see the starting of the Swedish style as we know it, the classic Swedish sound. I would say it comes, for me, mostly from Nihilist, more than Merciless or Morbid or any other band. Whereas in the American, the Floridian scene, it's a bit more difficult to say who was the first to come up with the formula. Like, some people say it's Death, some people say it's Morbid Angel, some people even say that Necrovore was very important as an influence. And with the Swedish case, I think it's quite clear to say that the bands that came afterwards took mainly from Nihilist. What do you think?
I'd concur to that. Like, I mean, Merciless in these bands are important, but you're right in that the one that kind of exploded the scene is Nihilist, and then what would carry on with, I mean, even in Nihilist, you get Entombed and Unleashed from the members. I guess essentially you would say Nihilist and Carnage are really the two starting points.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, not just the fact that two bands formed out of Nihilist, but a lot of the early Nihilist tracks ended up on Entombed's first album. And Carnage, I love their one album, is it Dark Recollections? But again, I think a couple of those songs ended up being Dismember songs as well. So they're like the two foundational documents of like the backbone of the Swedish style, definitely. So yeah, I guess we're leading into talking about, I'm really trying not to say the big four, just because whenever you say big three or big four, people sort of say, "Oh, that's simplifying it." But it's just a shorthand to say we're talking about Unleashed, Entombed, Dismember, and Grave. Grave were really kind of like, they're the Anthrax of the big four in that they probably shouldn't be there, but they get sort of put there out of convenience, because they have the buzzsaw guitar tone, and yeah, they did release a couple of decent albums at the time, but they are way more basic than the others. Although I guess some people would argue that Unleashed are just as basic, but they have more of a kind of character, and they are kind of like the oddball ones out of those bands, because they went for a much kind of I'm not a guitar guy, I'm not a music tech guy, so I don't really know what the terminology is, but the guitar tone is much clearer, and I would say it's kind of almost more retro in a way, even for that time. And obviously they lent more into the Viking thing, which turned out to be very influential on a lot of bands subsequently. But it's really like, yeah, it's Entombed and Dismember that really kind of set the standard for what the Swedish sound would become in a lot of ways, with Entombed's first two albums and Dismember's Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. And that's really where we do see the kind of what I was referencing in the introduction in terms of the combination of very, very grand, sweeping, epic heavy metal combined with very, very raw, sort of D-beat infused death metal come thrash in a lot of ways. And that really does lend itself to that guitar tone. And it's really what sets them apart from the Tampa scene, who, although you do get some primitive bands from there, like Massacre and things like that, but the Tampa scene was really getting quite technical by 1990-91 with, Death going on to do Spiritual Healing and Human and stuff like that. Morbid Angel becoming much more ambitious and sort of grandiose in what they wanted to do with Blessed Are the Sick, and obviously bands like Atheist. I mean, even a band as primal as Deicide, they were going for something quite dense and sort of considerably complex with something like Legion. Whereas when you compare that to something like Left Hand Path is much more I don't know, sparse. It's not a simple album by any measure, but it is quite a sort of straight to the throat kind of approach. And much of Dismember's first album as well does a lot of that, although again they reach for this very sort of grand epic expression as well in a lot of those tracks as well. So yeah, what are your thoughts on like these sort of, I don't know how else to describe, like foundational documents of what's put Swedish death metal on the map?
It's funny because for a long time I would probably think of other bands and other albums, but when conversations with friends and people in the scene come up about your favorite death metal album, or if you had to pick one classic, these days I tend to probably go for Entombed's Left Hand Path above everything else. That's one that I just kind of keep on returning to, and
like a comfort blanket. Or...
Yeah, yeah, a lot of enjoyment, which is not to discredit anything else in Dismember, especially early Dismember. I mean, I enjoy quite a bit as well. But there is something about the first Entombed album that just pulls me in every time. Just the riff writing, the hooks. It's a very interesting thing where that whole personality of that band, especially with Nicky Anderson being a drummer, being the primary songwriter of the band. I guess maybe you could compare that a little bit to Autopsy. But it just feels like Nicky had so many different things he was putting into the music, filtered into what, felt like death metal. But when you look at it, there's a lot of all sorts of different type of rock and roll, and heavy metal and other things. So yeah, just pound for pound, Left Hand Path. Just the older I get, the more, to me, that's just sort of the pinnacle of early death metal. In my estimation. But the other thing is, like, all four of those bands, like their first album in particular is pretty fantastic. I mean, Dismember with God, I'm forgetting the name of it. Shelley, what's the title?
Like an Ever-Flowing Stream.
Stream, yes. Is just a fantastic record. And then Unleashed. Unleashed is a band I don't enjoy their full discography, really. It gets a little tiresome at a certain point, but I mean, throwing on Where No Life Dwells, that just hits every time. It's a fantastic album. And the first two Grave albums, Grave, interestingly, was a band that it took me, I never fully got into them, but actually even preparing for this episode, listening to more of their early stuff, it's actually starting to click with me more. So I'm starting to, very, very late to this, but appreciating them ever more. And I think that there's good reason of them, compared to the American Big Four that like talk about a Swedish Big Four. I mean, they're definitely they're great for good reason. They may not have continued being great, but certainly at the start, all of their early albums are pretty fantastic.
So yeah, I do have a couple of things to come in on, but Belisario, I'll hand to you first before I do.
Oh, for me, the definitive Swedish death metal album would be Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. I don't like that much the first Entombed one, and even if it sounds like blasphemy a bit, but I have a reason for that, because at the time I discovered Entombed, I was listening to the first Nihilist demos also pretty much at the same time, and I did like the rawer take Nihilist was doing of pretty much the same material. So I think I like more what Nihilist did before and then was arranged by Entombed than the very Entombed production. So I would stay with Dismember as the definitive, like the upper expression of the style, so to speak. While for Grave and Unleash, I think it's a more basic take on that style. I like it also, but let's say for me it's a bit less expressive and more and rawer, like more dense, so to speak.
Yeah, I come and go from like particularly the first Grave album, but it has its place as far as if you just want to scratch that itch, it really does the trick. I do tend to agree with the assessment of Dismember. I think that album kind of reaches the furthest out of the first albums from these bands, just in terms of how far it goes in each direction, from the very primal and primitive to the very, very sophisticated and almost like vulnerable in places as well. And yeah, just concurring as well on some of the riffs on an album like Left Hand Path, where it does almost you kind of do hear the anticipation of the death and roll thing, because some of the riffs could almost be blues licks at times. And because Tyler's unfortunately not here, I do have to go out and bat for Unleashed a little bit, because I took a long time to come around to them, because I'd already heard something like an Ever-Flowing Stream. I was listening to Unleashed and I was like, well, this is really dirt basic stuff. I'd rather sort of listen to something like Celtic Frost or whatever, who they are obviously aping quite a lot. But Tyler's he's selected them a couple of times on episodes, partly because I think it's Darkness Shall Rise Productions re-released all of their early material before their debut, and it made me go back and sort of explore early Unleashed. And it does have a strange kind of fascination to it in a lot of ways. It's sort of very in stripping everything back, they kind of get to you see the sort of guts of how a basic death metal track is formed, and there is something weirdly meditative to it. I feel like that's how Tyler listens to music anyway, because he listens to Morbid Vision so much. He likes the sort of the very stripped back, just the essentials, and that's kind of what you get from Unleashed, at least up until their second album. The other tidbit I should mention about these albums is the Sunlight Studios thing, with producer Thomas Skogsberg, who was behind a lot of these albums, and he was kind of considered the Swedish Scott Burns. And one thing, I recently read the Decibel magazine's book on Scott Burns, which is what kind of drove me to do the episode on the Tampa scene. But one of the tidbits that came out of that was when Napalm Death went to Morrisound to record Harmony Corruption, the drummer Mick Harris, he did not get on with Scott Burns. Apparently he was quite sure in terms of he wasn't really ready to be a death metal drummer, and it's not surprising that he left Napalm Death not long after that album was released. Partly because although he was a very sort of expressive drummer, he wasn't doing very, very consistent takes, and Scott Burns kept saying you need to do that take better. It kept the tempo kept changing or whatever. And Mick Harris, being of a quite sort of fiery temperament, got very frustrated with this, but he was also frustrated with the fact that they didn't have the drum sound on Left Hand Path. He wanted that drum sound. He wanted the album to sound like Left Hand Path, and Scott Burns was very against this because the drums on that were samples, I believe. Real drummer, but it was sampled snare sound and stuff, and that's just not how Scott Burns wanted to operate. And it's interesting because although I kind of respect the authenticity that Burns was trying to get out there, and obviously he produced a lot of like the most respected albums in death metal, I do kind of prefer the atmosphere that you get on Left Hand Path. I don't care if the drums are sampled or not. You do get a very kind of powerful, kind of overwhelming sound. Especially considering that this was 1990, this is very early on. It's a very, very kind of immersive album for that time. So even though these bands that are essentially of a sort of punk lineage, they are going for quite an enthralling atmosphere, I think, which is one thing I do find compelling about them.
Do you think it's funny because when I think about that, like whether it's Left Hand Path or like an Ever Flowing Stream, like there's a certain, and again, I don't know if it's other associations I'm bringing into it, but like it the sound of the albums, it feels cold. Like there's a coldness, like a crisp air to it. I don't know if you feel, and maybe that's reflected in kind of the production.
Possibly. I don't want to be projecting because when I was listening to a lot of this stuff, I was like, I'd heard of Swedish death metal because it was sort of already known to me before I listened to it properly and got into it properly. But you kind of associate, well, Sweden, that's cold and wintry, and this is going to be cold.
Yeah, I know, but no, I agree. I definitely am conscious that I'm maybe interjecting that into it, but at the same time, when I listen to anything from Morrisound, like I never feel that. But then when it comes to those Sunlight Studio recordings, including as well something like Dark Throne, the first Soulside album, it's something I recognize in it.
Yeah, I would say more than darkness, maybe it's kind of nocturnal in a way. Sorry, Belisario, you're going to jump in then.
Oh, yes. I was going to say that I feel too certain warmness in everything that came out of Morrisound. And partly I think it's because, for example, the drums never sound too loud on anything Scott Burns touched. And when you hear later bands or bands from Sweden, maybe because they had worse equipment, but usually the drums sound a bit louder.
Yeah, I mean, that is one thing I don't like about Harmony Corruption. As much as I respect Scott Burns' work, I don't like the production on that album because it sounds very warm and the drums sound a little bit weak. And I'm comparing it to the next album, Utopia Banished, which was produced by Colin Richardson, who was responsible for most of the Earache roster at that time, including Carcass and Bolt Thrower, amongst others. And I much prefer the production on Utopia Banished because it's a very, very powerful snare sound. It's obviously referencing a more like industrial kind of aesthetic. And that's obviously it's in proximity to stuff like Godflesh. And that's much more fitting of who Napalm Death were. I think as internationally renowned as they are, they always remain quite a British and English and urban band. They're very much of the industrial sprawl of Birmingham, and I don't think they ever left that behind. And I think Richardson captured that much more effectively than Burns, whereas Burns is very, very suited to capturing a band like Obituary, who are Florida sort of through and through. And on an album like Cause of Death, you get that very warm, swampy kind of almost like cloying, slimy atmosphere, which is just perfect for that album. In a lot of ways. And I mean, I said I wasn't going to project, but I'm just doing it anyway. And then an album like Left Hand Path, just to take it as like the archetypical of the, Swedish bands. It has this very powerful kind of grandiose sound, and part of that is the snare sound, but it is also that guitar tone. And they do like meld in moments of very, very kind of labored melodic kind of material. Most famously on the title track, like the finale of it, when it goes very, very slow and it's just a very, very kind of epic kind of overture or whatever. It's very, very sort of fitting of what you expect of a Scandinavian band, I suppose.
Now that you mention the guitar tone and the distortion, there's always, people usually point out that Swedish death metal is about certain settings of distortion and guitar. But I think, in my opinion, it's more like about a flow, like how songs advance and go forward. It's more when you listen to Floridian death metal, for example, you hear the instruments, each one on the side, and usually the drums are quite clear. But in Swedish death metal, maybe it's in partly the inheritance of D-beat or hardcore, but to me it sounds a bit more cohesive, everything together, and it preludes in a way what black metal would do later to put everything together as in sort of a wall of sound. So for me, it's more like the music advances all the time together instead of doing separate things individually.
One thing that I want to comment on with Entombed and Dismember at this time, I'm a sucker for any kind of metal band that plays around with their dynamics and, has maybe a song with some slow parts, kind of builds up the tension. And you just mentioned the title track from Left Hand Path, and, part of the reason I love that album is I enjoy that track so much. I love kind of the little journey it takes you on, with the little atmospheric bits and then slowing down and then the melodic riffing near the end. But Dismember, I mean, in many ways did this sort of the same thing, just one album later on Indecent Obscene with Dreaming in Red, which I think does the same thing in their own way, but really quite well. In a way that like Grave and Unleashed didn't really have that, I think. But both bands have those two songs as real highlights for me, and make those albums quite memorable.
Well, speaking of that, we should probably mention bands that kind of sit out of that. I'm going to defer the melodic death metal discussion just a little bit because I want to talk about early Therion, because probably one of their first two albums, especially Beyond Sanctorum, probably one of my favorite Swedish metal albums, full stop. Yes, I'm aware Bathory are from Sweden as well. Just because I think they do, I've put them under sort of an anomalous but important category. But I don't think, going over a lot of Swedish death metal, I don't think they are that anomalous. I could say that someone like Early Cemetery, possibly At the Gates as well, maybe Edge of Sanity. A lot of these other bands were going for something that sort of combines visceral element with something quite epic, but also something a little bit surreal as well. And I think early Therion really managed to capture a lot of that. And it's interesting that obviously you can't really mention Therion without talking about the fact that they dramatically changed styles over the years and kind of went operatic and whatever. And they probably sort of took that as them taking steps to be far more ambitious in a lot of ways. But I always find that the style on Beyond Sanctorum to be more ambitious than any of that in terms of it's quite progressive in a lot of ways. They do write some very, very lengthy pieces and they cohere together as like internally consistent narratives. They touch on a lot of different styles as well. They use keys and scales that were quite unusual for death metal at the time. They weren't afraid of quite lavish keyboards and synthesizers, but it's also a very kind of violent sort of primal album in a lot of places as well. And it's probably not anomalous is what I'm going for. I think it's sort of the best in its class as far as how Swedish death metal was able to reach far beyond what a lot of other scenes were doing at the time. Even, I mean, we've mentioned Tambra a lot of times, they had a lot of ambitious bands, but they weren't going for such a gothic flavor or such a sort of romantic kind of flavor to what they were doing. Any thoughts on like that oeuvre?
I mean, I've definitely listened to early Therion, and I kind of reminded myself of it. It's not a period that I often go back and revisit, but it's good, and I certainly take your more kind of sitting in the soup longer take on them. I mean, Beyond Sanctorum, I think is a particularly good album of death metal striving to be beyond its limits. Definitely incorporating more epic kind of, which just foreshadowed what they would do very quickly from there. It's interesting. I was thinking about it. Compared to like the Florida scene, the Swedish scene really didn't take long, and it's it's not the only scene, like the Finnish scene just as much, and certainly some others, but compared to the Florida scene, the Swedish scene was very, from the start, not exactly highly progressive, but a lot of the bands in it, including the wider range of bands, very quickly went into different genre directions. Obviously, we can talk about Entombed with that, them being one of the quickest to do that. But like when in relation to Therion and bands like this, the one that I'm particularly partial to is Tiamat, who I was going to mention this earlier. I think people love to point out that Sumerian Cry, their first album, was actually, I think, recorded in Sunlight before Left Hand Path was. So even though they came out around the same time, Sumerian Cry technically is like the first professional studio Swedish death metal album. And Tiamat very, very quickly went into sort of psychedelic, alt rock, goth rock kind of trajectory. But even up through the third album, Clouds, which came out again really early on, like only in '92, still had some death metal roots, even though at that point they were very clearly moving beyond it. But yeah, I think if anyone is getting interest in Swedish death metal and taking a look at these bands that started in it and were certainly a big part of it, but then very quickly transitioned, Tiamat's usually my focal point.
I agree with that. And yeah, I'm not very fond of Tiamat because I think from the beginning they were already having these blues influences that came around and even sometimes killing the atmosphere or the advance of some songs. And even in the first album, I'm not very fond of them, and they quite quickly switched the style like Entombed did. And this is something we may point out because it's quite important for the Swedish scenes, like the switching to older styles of rock or blues music as a constant. I think it happens more in the Swedish scene than in other death metal scenes.
Oh, agreed. Like, yeah, I mean, you look at the Florida ones, and I mean, the only one that's comparable in sort of like being really kind of rock rooted, I think Obituary in a way kind of became that. Nowhere as much as Entombed, but I don't know. It's weird in that the Swedish scene, obviously, like, I mean, progressive metal is a big thing in Sweden. It's something that exploded, but it was very much something that kind of came after, was influenced by what happened in the early 90s rather than a lot of those bands becoming it, compared to like how progressive Death became, or progressive even Morbid Angel, or technical at least, Morbid Angel became. The Swedish scene wasn't terribly obsessed with technicality, but then sort of like later generations of the Swedish scene certainly have taken that on.
Yeah, I would say if I was to sort of sum it up, the Florida scene had a progressive element to it almost from its inception, with Atheist and Cynic and bands like that, and yeah, Death taking it up very, very quickly after that. Whereas the Swedish scene, I would say its ethos was more romantic, or it has this kind of primal element to it, which one could say is sort of monstrosity, which obviously has a lot of crossover with romanticism as a theme, but it's very much more comfortable flirting with high fantasy, gothic horror, and just sort of, yeah, more romantic themes in general. And yeah, as you say, Joseph, later on it became interested in sort of progressive music with a capital P. I was just quickly looking it up. Sumerian Cry was recorded in October of '89. Left Hand Path was December, so it was a matter of months, really. But if you want to get petty about it. And then, yeah, I was just also curious. Carnage's Dark Recollections was February the following year, so it really was like months apart. But most of these tracks were written '89-ish, prior to that anyway. And as I said, a lot of them were on the Nihilist demos anyway.
Well, and
Yeah.
even with Tiamat, like the early stuff is Treblinka, which is comparable to Nihilist in terms of that a little blackened like demo death metal.
Just off the back of that as well, because Tyler's not here, because I mentioned Therion, I have to mention Carbonized in the same breath, who I don't really think of them as a death metal band. I think of them more of a grindcore band, but I think just off the back of what you were saying about the progressive element, an album like For the Security or even Disharmonization, actually, they're kind of the inverse of what bands like Nuclear Death or like wacky grindcore bands are doing, maybe Brutal Truth, Blood to some extent, and it's kind of a Swedish interpretation of that, in that you obviously get the punk element to it, but the more for want of a better word, avant-garde elements to those albums are still rooted in this kind of sense of almost like a dignified darkness to them. They're very, very atmospheric in a lot of ways. Just quickly, I don't know if you have any thoughts on For the Security. I know I don't think I put them on the list, but
Unfortunately, a band I'm not terribly familiar with.
Okay.
I do. It's grindcore mixed with death metal, if I do recall correctly.
Yeah, it's more on the death grind side, so I'd say it's closer to something like Blood than it is more of the sort of punky side of grindcore. But there's lots of kind of weird tangents in that For the Security album. It was released in 1991, I should say, just to contextualize it. But yeah, it's given that it came from some of the guys in Therion, it's a very interesting album to listen to sort of study the early kind of development of those musicians. And Disharmonization, released a couple of years later, probably a bit too far into the avant-garde metal territory for some. I'd say it kind of references an album like Into Pandemonium, but in a grindcore setting. So it's a really kind of neat companion piece to some of the weirder elements of like early Swedish death metal, but not for everyone necessarily. But again, just because for absent friends, I had to mention them. Although I believe Tyler might have just joined us. Are you there, Tyler?
I am here. Hi, everybody. I completely
Hello.
forgot this was happening today.
I was worried you had some sort of emergency going on.
No emergencies, just sheer forgetfulness. I was so accustomed to us doing this on Sunday that I didn't think about the fact that it was upcoming.
I think you're a Carbonized fan, so I don't know if you want to come in on them. I was just talking about For the Security as like a weird companion piece to some of that, the wackier elements of early Swedish death metal.
Yeah, I absolutely can do that. It's one of my all-time favorite albums.
I knew I was on the right track with saying I sort of thought I'd need to speak about Carbonized in your absence, but now you're here, you can do it. So.
All right. Well, yeah, Carbonized For the Security is absolutely fantastic. It's a weird combination of a more aggressive style of grindcore in the vein of Terrorizer or Repulsion, and then some very odd experimentation, kind of along the lines that you would hear to what Therion was doing, partly with On of Darkness and Into the Pandemonium. Or Into the Pandemonium, that's Celtic Frost. Beyond Sanctorum. But I think that it's a wonderfully weird and fantastic journey of an album. It has a somewhat dystopian or even melancholic feel at times, but it has one of the elements that is a perennial favorite of mine with any extreme music album. I know there's a big fight sometimes between people about whether it's a death metal or a grindcore album, which is that it has a very straightforward sort of flow or stream of melody approach, which I find very endearing. I sometimes listen to that album on repeat. I get to the last track and just flip it back to the first and run it through again.
Yeah, I was just saying it's I mean for me it's a grindcore album. I think if stuff like it sits more on the death grind side obviously, but um I don't think it's sort of coherent enough to be considered death metal. But the way it's sort of very ambitious grind in a similar way to something like Brutal Truths Need to Control, in that it doesn't sort of see grindcore as a limiting label. It goes off on very strange and yeah borderline progressive avant-garde tangents at times, but without being overly indulgent or obnoxious. Um, and yeah, it's a great companion piece to an album like Beyond Sanctorum, whose praises I was also just singing. Um, which yeah I guess could lead us into a discussion of what I've called kind of like um the sort of romanticist outliers of the Swedish death metal. I'm thinking bands like Cemetery with their first album, what is it, A Darker Shade of Grey. And you could see the crossover with British Gothic Doom, particularly with like Paradise Lost, to a lesser extent My Dying Bride as well. Um, or an album like Gormont's The Ending Quest, which for me is kind of like the follow-up to Amorphous' debut that Amorphous weren't quite able to manage. And these are bands that they're very in keeping with the sort of yin to Florida's yang, in that they go in a much more romantic direction. I think they're sort of true ancestors of an album like Into the Pandemonium, um, in that they flirt with doom metal, they flirt with goth metal, but they still have their roots in like the foundations of what Swedish death metal was in punk, and in this very sort of direct interpretation of death metal that's still very, very informed by heavy metal in a lot of ways, which I guess it would alienate some fans that were kind of listening to Malevolent Creation or Suffocation or stuff like that. It's just a sort of very different direction that they went in. But as Joseph pointed out, it was quite brief as well. Therion didn't take long to kind of move on. Gormont only managed one album. Cemetery kind of moved on to whatever the fuck they did. It was awful. I listened to one track of the follow-up album and it was just sort of more in the kind of melodeath direction, I guess, but not good melodeath. But yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on those bands? Or you could probably make Catatonia in the same breath as well.
Yeah. Gormont, I think, is a fantastic one. It does kind of have sort of a Finnish vibe to it. There's a very, I don't know, melancholic kind of nature to that, despite being very much death metal. I think that's if you want to look at the early Swedish scene, even though that did come out in '94, so a little later than a lot of stuff, that would be a great example of a hidden gem in the scene that most people kind of having a cursory look through Swedish death metal may not ever come across, but it's a fantastic album.
Yeah, I liken it to Demolich's Nesbive, although obviously totally different style, but it's like some of these bands just had the guile to like form in the background, release one of the best albums you ever heard, and then just disappear.
Yeah, the outlier sect of Swedish death metal is really interesting. I mean, you have bands like Therion, At the Gates, Necrophobic, that were all kind of moving in different directions from what most people think of when they think of the Swedish death metal sound, a la Entombed, Dismember, and so on and so forth. They all kind of have some similarities in taking a more experimental approach. There's like elements of the gothic metal, I think, almost in all of them in a way, and that they have a more morose, um, melancholic approach at times, or at least a more fully fleshed out one. You hear some of those kind of melodies in Entombed and Dismember and so on and so forth as well. But they definitely kind of flesh it out a little bit more, and add their own flourishes to it. I mean, necrophobic in kind of a more black metal way, although I would still argue that the Nocturnal Silence is largely a death metal album. Um, and Therion with much more influences from doom metal and from traditional heavy metal, and then at the gates with whatever it was that Alf Svensson was into and doing on The Red in the Sky Is Ours. Um, but they're really interesting bands in that regard uh, because of the fact that while they are part of the Swedish canon, so to speak, they were showing different directions that approach could be taken in.
Yeah, definitely. Before I come in on that, Belisario, have you got any thoughts on these bands?
Oh, they were nice addition to the scene because when you look at the big four, like you said before, their sound is quite similar among them. So it was a good thing to have bands exploring different things like Gothic, which is an influence I think, like you said, comes mainly from England, or more grindcore or progressive stuff. So even if in the beginning everything was quite homogeneous, soon there were bands exploring different ways. So the scene developed, especially in a time when the first bands were changing their style dramatically. So it was a good thing to have bands continuing with within metal.
Yeah, definitely. And just before we move on, because I'm gonna bleed it into sort of the discussion around melodic death metal because that was like what Sweden became known for a couple of years after this sort of flurry of activity. But I just wanted to briefly discuss Catatonia because I hear a lot of shit about them in terms of how terrible they are. But I really like their first album. I've not full disclosure, I've not listened to anything other than their first album, but I don't like to use the word elitist, but quote unquote self-identifying elitists really, really shit on that band. What am I missing about them?
Well, I actually, it's funny because I think the average Catatonia fan tends to focus on the stuff they've done over the last 2016 or so years, and I don't particularly like that material, but I actually do like a lot of the material where they fully went away from death metal. I think I just don't like it where I think they fully gave up even a bit of metal to their sound and kind of tried to sound more like, I don't know, something closer to Deftones meets Radiohead or something like that. But I am someone who will enjoy everything up to Viva Emptiness. But yeah, the early stuff is very clearly in the extreme metal scene. In the first album and EP, there's definitely like early black metal. There's elements of that to it. There's death metal. There's definitely doom. It's similar, as you pointed out before, the Peaceful 3. There's definitely kind of some similar paths being tread there. It's an interesting relationship, especially like I don't want to talk about this band too much, but obviously with something like Opeth, and then given the fact that those guys went on to later form what was sort of the first tribute band to the original early Swedish death scene with Bloodbath, and how big that's gotten, and the fact that now you have Nicholas from Paradise Lost headline, fronting that band. So there's a lot of interwoven paths with that. But yeah, no, I think if, and I certainly think they're mentioned in a lot of the books that are out there about Swedish death metal, but not for nothing, Catatonia is a band to mention with that scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And the other thing I find, sorry, Belisario, did you want to come in on that?
I was going to say that to me it's more like a gothic metal band, similar to the English ones at the beginning, and then it clearly became a rock band. And I'd try to be nice and say not in a very good way, because for example, for me, Paradise Lost became a rock band, but in a good way, while Catatonia did not, and maybe all the hate they have gotten is because you saw them headlining festivals some time ago when all the other bands were metal, and then you get a big band like them playing rock songs, and that can be a bit annoying I'm saying this because it happened to me a long time ago.
I mean, I would say even from their first album, I would draw comparisons with something like The Gathering, who veered between goth, death doom, and then essentially what I would consider sort of vaguely alternative rock or whatever. And I like some of The Gathering, like because I'm still like very, very affectionate of goth. There's a lot of crossover there, and some of the early Gathering stuff is still does it for me. And Catatonia seem to be in that same category of sort of playing death metal because that's kind of what everyone was doing in the early 90s. And when it became more free by the mid 90s, they moved away from that. And that seems to be the case with a lot of the Swedish bands as well, is they sort of got a sense of freedom and sort of went their own way. But sometimes with kind of mixed results when you listen back to it, some of it sounds very, very dated.
I mean, the other thing with the Finnish scene as well, having some prime examples, obviously Amorphous, but with like Catatonia, a big comparison would be someone like Sentence, where they did kind of really become that sort of like suicidal goth rock metal kind of thing. And I mean, again, my taste, I actually like that from Sentence quite a bit. But it's definitely not something that I would play at the same time I want to hear something like Dismembered.
Yeah, true. So speaking of bands that change direction, have you guys heard of a band called In Flames?
Never heard.
Nope. I've heard of a Japanese band called In Frames. Are they similar?
Oh no, this is a different band, Tyler. I think you've got mixed up.
So I'll have an interesting anecdote for this, but do continue.
No, I was just going to say, so I'm going to move into melodic death metal now. We have to mention In Flames because I quite like their first album. We've touched on At the Gates. We have done a focus episode on At the Gates with Necropolis before, but it was only myself and Tyler who were here that appeared on that episode, so we can talk about them as well. And yeah, we also need to mention the likes of maybe Eucharist and Dark Tranquility, speaking again of bands that changed their style quite a lot.
Before we go into that, can I mention one aspect of the early scene that we haven't touched on?
Oh yeah, of course, go ahead.
I think even more so than the other band I'm going to mention that this gets renumbered, there's a lot of mixed paths between different genres, and with black metal in particular. And a prime example is very much like what happened with Dark Throne. You have one of the earliest second wave black metal bands in Norway, Marduk, essentially starting as a death metal band. That first album, Dark Endless, it has some black metal to it, but I would still classify it essentially as a death metal album. And then, like many a band under the influence of Euronymous, very quickly switched into full-throated black metal. But I think it's sort of just interesting to see how like a band like that, if Euronymous had never happened, maybe would have continued on that death metal path.
Well, yeah, I do have in my sort of scribbling notes to discuss the crossover with black metal. So Tyler's already mentioned Necrophobic, who, yeah, I would agree they're definitely in the death metal camp, but they were definitely a crossover band. Ditto someone like Dissection, maybe even Sacramentum as well. We talk about Dawn, and yeah, Marduk would be another really good example of that, where there's this cross-pollination between them and the Norwegian scene, even if the antagonism was what they kind of voiced in public. But in the early days, there was real kind of affiliation. Then Euronymous decided to kind of create this sort of manufacture, this sort of scenic rivalry or whatever, but the music still overlapped massively. And yeah, that's where you get this, what I would say is what defines like Swedish black metal against the Norwegian style, definitely. But also, like, to that, I don't think that's irrelevant to discussing melodic death metal, because I think At the Gates were a very important band in the development of black metal, not least because of what I mentioned with Thomas Lindberg designing the logo for Dark Throne, but also just the... Sorry, go on. What were you gonna...
No, I was just going to concur with you that, I mean, we can go into, like, yeah, the full-on melodic. I just thought, given Marduk with that first album being 92, if we were moving like in terms of years ahead. But no, we can talk about black metal later. With Thomas Lindbergh, I mean, Grotesque definitely had a bit of a black metal edge to it. And the interesting thing, if you read the the book about Metallion, about the black metal scene, Thomas and John from Dissection being good buddies and both being friends of Euronymous often came out to Norway to hang out with the Mayhem guys. So there was a lot of direct influence on them with that. And it's very interesting to imagine those like gatherings in Norway and Thomas being right in the middle of that, given how different a band like At the Gates would become.
Yeah, it's also interesting just to think that so At the Gates' debut, The Red in the Sky is Ours, which for myself is probably their best, but it's not a very Swedish sounding album. As Tyler alluded to, the style is kind of hard to pin down. You could say it's jazz influenced, neoclassical. There was some elements of sort of heavy metal melody in there as well, but what they were doing was so far off the wall that it was largely overlooked at the time. But then their follow up with Fear I Kiss the Burning Darkness was recorded at Sunlight, and you get the more typical Swedish sound. You get a kind of echo of the iconic buzzsaw guitar tone. The production is slightly colder, more sterile, sort of in line with what, again, the Big Four were doing a couple of years earlier. But it's still a weird album. It's still got some really, really interesting, sort of very idiosyncratic melodic material in there. But you also, and we discussed this again at length on the Focus episode, the second half, you do start to see the germinal of what would become an album like Slaughter of the Soul. And it's a weird sort of gateway, not just for Swedish death metal, in that it kind of binds the Outliers with the more primal stuff that Entombed were doing, but it also seemed to be a watershed moment for At the Gates themselves in terms of they were on a precipice and they could have gone really, really further into sort of borderline avant-garde territory, or do what they actually did, which is kind of bring their sort of domesticate their style a little bit to cater for what was becoming quite mainstream taste by the mid 90s, with sort of melodic death metal starting to gain a sort of respectable popularity by the standards of death metal, and that coincided with bands like In Flames, who I think their debut was 93 or 94, and Dark Tranquillity, again, not a bad debut album. I know that a lot of people shit on Dark Tranquillity, but I was listening to their debut album yesterday, and it's okay. It has that silly sort of gothic flavor to it again, but at the time it probably wasn't that silly. It just sounds dated to our ears now, but there's still some really interesting stuff on there. But I think, not to put words in his mouth, but someone like Jason would find it far too heavy metal influenced. But it's interesting that At the Gates were kind of meeting at the intersection of these styles. So yeah, any thoughts on like that watershed moment, I guess, around 1993 when these bands started leaning into a more commercial sound?
Tyler, you can go ahead.
It's Well, I mean, I think it kind of aligns with the gradual mainstreaming of Swedish death metal in general, right? I mean, talking about like something like At the Gates leading into melodic death metal around the same time, or if I'm not mistaken, around the same time, you also see a band like Entombed kind of exploding. There was somewhat like of an interest in death metal as a genre from mainstream labels around that point. They seemed to think that it was going to explode and be the next kind of grungy rebellion music that was going to be big in the rock scene, or at least one of them. Um, and I don't know if that had an effect upon other bands that somewhat went in a more commercial direction, who were hoping to capitalize on that kind of cultural undercurrent. Um, but uh, yeah, it's obviously something that I am not particularly fond of. I know many other people are, and I understand why they are. Um, but yeah, anyhow, I guess that's my 2 cents on it.
Um, well, I have the anecdote that I can throw in this, but the one thing I'd mention is, yeah, I mean, the Gothenburg scene, in a weird way, is kind of the scene that would have the biggest impact overall in terms of global music and metal and hardcore and punk in general. I mean, the whole American metalcore scene eventually came out of that. I think it's pretty clear that, and you got to be careful of those words because I'm going to have some integrity fan say I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Not that nor the metallic hardcore, but like that whole scene from the early 2000s that exploded of stuff like God forbid Shadows Fall, As I Lie Dying, all of that stuff. Black Dollar Murder being a good example. All of that taken a lot from what before they broke up, those last couple of recordings from At the Gates, In Flames from the mid 90s onward, and bands like Dark Tranquillity, Soilwork. I mean, that had a big legacy in terms of how those bands became so big, and those bands becoming so big often helped then bring those bands even bigger. And I'd even argue by the early 2000s, In Flames abandoning every vestige of death metal to pretty much embrace this sort of metallic metalcore that they kind of helped create in the first place. Kind of very cynically, maybe, to give them credit, maybe they wanted to do that, but, jumping into that. Because after being generous, after Clayman, I wouldn't call anything even like 20% death metal. Before that, sure, and you could like it or not like it, but like Horticle and Colony, very still melodic, highly melodic death metal. But so the Gothenburg scene is in a way is the second half of the Swedish scene that in a lot of ways is known more because of how big of an impact it's had on the metal world in general.
I realize we're far from home now, but Belisario, do you have any thoughts on, I don't know,
Yeah, it's an easy thing
period?
to say. It's a band we love to hate. The bands we love to hate, all of them. So I guess we pretty much agree with that we don't like them. But as a phenomenon,
Depending on when.
most of them maybe. But as a phenomenon, I think it's quite interesting because it's a way of making death metal, which was originally harsh and underground, to make it something accessible, something brighter, and then something commercial even, because even nowadays most people who like heavy metal but not extreme metal, they do agree that melodeath is a nice thing they can listen to, while they wouldn't listen to any other kind of extreme metal. So it has been really successful and important.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting that, so for American death metal in particular, the bands that sort of adapted and changed, I'm not thinking of someone like Incantation here, but groove metal was the thing, and I'm thinking of the impact of bands like Pantera or what Sepultura became by the mid-90s, and obviously just the cross-pollination with upcoming new metal bands. A lot of death metal bands started incorporating groove elements, even bands like Morbid Angel or whatever. Whereas in Europe, it was very much mellow death. But what Joseph was talking about in terms of the influence on the 2000s metalcore thing, there was a lapse. Like At the Gates broke up after Slaughter of the Soul, and there was this late 90s period. I know they formed The Haunted afterwards, but they weren't really a big deal until a little bit later. There was this lapse where sort of the younger generation kind of caught up with what they were doing and decided they liked it, and they would pick it up and turn it into a even more commercially viable thing. And that by the late 2000s encouraged a lot of these bands to reform. Again, I know they're not Swedish, but I'm also thinking about bands like Carcass, who their Heartwork album was very, very formative to a lot of this as well. Enough for a lot of younger fans to rediscover them, and for them to think, well, it's probably worth reforming and doing some gigs. And that's where we kind of get a lot of this renaissance of older bands rediscovering a younger audience in a lot of ways.
And, you touched on it with Carcass. It was something I was going to mention that, when I think of the melodic death metal scene, I kind of look at, and of the examples of it of the early days, one of the better albums and ones I still keep on going back to is Carcass's Heartwork. And that kind of predates a lot of the Gothenburg scene, with that coming out in 93. And In Flames really not hitting until 96 or so, and then but At the Gates was 95 with Slaughter of the Soul. I think a lot of people look at, when they think of the biggest, most popular albums, in that it's usually Carcass's Heartwork and At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul, and certainly with those bands reuniting, it doesn't take much to look at metal magazines and stuff and see how celebrated those were. And then, of course, there's the very interesting biographical connection of that, because Michael Amott, who joined Carcass for necroticism, and then left after the recording sessions of Heartwork because he didn't like the direction, but then very quickly with Arch Enemy pretty much picked it up again.
I was gonna come on to him.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that he, it's not like he was an outlier of that before he joined Carcass, he was in Carnage. That's, he was essentially with the
Swedish
Dismember
death
guys.
metal band.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tyler, what were you going to say?
I said my favorite Swedish death metal band. I love Carnage.
So we were talking about this earlier. I'm laughing because I'm like, we were talking about Carnage earlier on. I was singing the praises of their one album, but I'm just like, trust Tyler to pick not a really obscure, but a relatively obscure band that released one album that's really solid, and then just say that's my favorite out of all of them.
Well, let's not go back to Carnage now, but I do want to interject with something here, and that is that I, on a personal level, find the term melodic death metal somewhat pretentious and insulting.
I know what you're going to say here, but go on.
In what way was all of death metal prior to melodic death metal utterly lacking in melody?
Well, I think, I think it's sort of like an argument that like people have in the metalcore scene about like that more like integrity or converge versus the more what people call melodic. I think the big change, between something like, because one thing I was going to get is that actually it doesn't get touched upon as much, but of those, the big Swedish four, the Stockholm scene, Dismember was extremely melodic, and even to the point that their mid '90s albums and later, like the one Death Metal, and then what was the one right before that one, Massive Killing Capacity, they're extremely melodic. And
like an Ever-Flowing Stream was as well.
And I would say more so than even Entombed, or like I think Grave and Unleashed were much more rhythm kind of rooted in groove. But yeah, Dismember has all sorts of melody to it. But I think when I think of the melodic death metal scene, I mean, when I hear that phrase, mostly to me, it just means that there's a lot of focus on sort of the twin guitar attack of Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. Like it's incorporating that into what had been the established death metal sound in the same way that Dissection did that, but then with a more black metal and Bathory influenced direction as well.
Which is more so a harmony thing than melody, really. And I know I have an unconventional definition of what melody is, but to me, I would almost argue that older death metal, even talking about American death metal bands like Deicide, were more melodic than In Flames because they had longer, more twisting, labyrinthine melodies. But I know that when most people say melodic, what they mean is a more conventional definition of it sounds pretty to my ear.
Well, I think you have a right point about the harmony. But for whatever reason, harmonic death metal never caught on.
Oh yeah, it's not catchy.
Yeah, I think when people say melody, that you're right, they do mean. This is something I've started trying to do when I'm writing about albums, is use the word lyrical. And I don't mean lyrical in terms of the vocals, but lyrical in terms of, is the guitar playing something that sounds like a vocal melody? I'm thinking, and because Jason's not here, I have to mention classical music at some point. I'm thinking of Grieg's lyric pieces here, where they're all composed for solo piano, but they are all pieces that could, in theory, be sung by a vocalist, because they are sort of little vignettes or poems or nursery rhymes or whatever about Norwegian nature or traditional culture and folk traditions and so on. But in the terms of metal, if you take a lot of the melodies from an album like Slaughter of the Soul, just to take an archetypical example, they are very, very kind of accessible, not in just in a pop sensibility, but they are quite like memorable. They're lyrical in that you could put a vocal melody to them. Whereas I take your point, Tyler, but you couldn't do that with something like Deicide's Legion in the same way. But I accept that that is kind of just sort of playing around with the definition of melody in a lot of way. And again, for some reason, lyrical death metal didn't really catch on as a label either. But yeah,
It sounds a bit weird.
Yeah. It's difficult because, yeah, in one sense, it was just a label that made sense in terms of demarcating what these bands are doing that was different from what had come before. And in one sense, it was different. Like Heartwork, Slaughter of the Soul, In Flames' debut, they were different from a lot of death metal at the time, but some would say different in quite a bad way, in that they brought it back to a more basic, accessible, popist sort of structure. But it was a shorthand way to kind of just label these bands. But in the sort of telling of the story, sort of legend became myth and myth became hearsay or whatever, and we forgot, as I think the point that Tyler's trying to make, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we forgot that older death metal did also have melody, and we've discussed this before with even an album as early as Seven Churches. There's some really good melodies on that album, and it's arguably one of the first death metal albums. I know that's kind of in dispute, whatever, but yeah.
One interesting point to make about the melodies and I like how you brought up the Grieg and the lyrical, because I'm not always the most familiar with classical music theory, but I think that's very much, because I often tell people that, like, to me, like, if I can't, like, if there isn't a riff where I can kind of hum along to it, I'm probably not going to like the band. That's not an absolute,
a damning indictment.
People can think what they want. I'm too old to care.
I'm just playing with you, Joseph.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. But no, because I'll talk about that, where like there's some stuff that, like, well, let's not get into that band, but there's some stuff I just really can't take an interest in. Mostly, and when I try to explain it to people, it's just like, yeah, there's not a riff that I feel like I kind of is going on, as you would say, like a lyrical path, that I could potentially sing along to necessarily. Then I just sort of lose interest. And it's, God, I'm losing track of what I was trying to say with that, but it's interesting with all this stuff, and I did want to include this anecdote that for me, my introduction in death metal was an odd about one, because I was not old enough to really get into it in the 90s, and certainly not the early 90s. So it was more the early 2000s. And I won't mention the other band whose album I picked up, but pretty much the first album I ever had with death metal vocals, like, so that type of guttural vocals, was In Flames' Jester Race. And I think it was because when I was trying to get into that, and at that point, the heaviest stuff I was listening to was probably thrash metal and stuff like King Diamond and other things like that. And probably some magazine article, probably Metal Maniacs or something, had probably mentioned how important an album that was, which is funny because by, I don't know, early or late 2001, early 2022, it was only, 5 years old, which is funny to think in hindsight now. But hearing that, and I immediately grabbed onto it. And for me, it was very easy to get into that because once I got past the vocals, like instrumentally, it was like, oh, this is just sort of like slightly different, distorted early Iron Maiden. Like I can very easily get into this.
Yeah, that explains a lot.
Well, I mean, I think that's probably the trajectory for a lot of people who got into heavy metal before they got into death metal, and
No,
certainly,
you're not off the mark, man. I mean, I got into classic death metal and melodic death metal at the same time when I was about 15 years old because I was a huge nerd who liked to, if I got into something, I liked to go online and research every single facet of it. So I scoured the internet for articles on death metal and read all about, oh, these were the first bands, these were major releases throughout its history. So I was listening to Seven Churches and Cause of Death at the same time as I was listening to The Jester Race and Oracle. But I did have a period of time where I did enjoy those albums. Uh, Allow me to lay down the gauntlet just a little bit, however, and say if one of the primary hallmarks of your style of metal is that you can openly show it to your peers who do not enjoy metal at all and even disdain it, and that they will find something enjoyable about it, then you should question its validity.
So I was going to say, this is why I delayed the Arch Enemy discussion, because Anthems of Rebellion, which I believe was released in 2003, was one of the first proper metal albums that I bought. I'd been into new metal before that, System of a Down, Mudvayne, I think even Cold Chamber at one point. But anyway, that's by the by. That was one of the first albums where I was like, this is really good. And it's probably because, yes, I was very familiar with Iron Maiden, that style of harmony that Michael Amott was doing at the time. And that sent me down a rabbit hole of, all the bands that we've been discussing in terms of The Haunted and At the Gates. And then I think listening to a band called Bathory sort of rewired my brain in a lot of ways. And it wasn't long after that I was listening to Burzum that sort of broke
Damn
me.
right.
Well, yeah, by the time I heard A Fine Day to Die, the sort of Arch Enemy was far in the rearview mirror. But Arch Enemy is a band that we don't need to discuss it in a lot of ways, but I find them very interesting because they do fit into that melodic, late 90s melodic death metal oeuvre, but because it's Michael Amott who, I think with hindsight, people blame him for the ruination of Carcass in a lot of ways because of what he went on to do with Arch Enemy, which was very similar to later At the Gates and In Flames, in that they're incorporating what is essentially Iron Maiden with a flex of like the vestiges of the Swedish death metal style. But he came from a very sort of respectable background, and yeah, he was on the Carnage album, which is one of Tyler's favorite death metal albums. So he's quite an interesting sort of figure in that respect. I know that even by the standards of Arch Enemy fans, they've kind of gone off a cliff in terms of sort of going into pop metal territory, but they're quite an interesting symptom of the homogenization of like that melodic death metal stream, which again, as I say, is like the yin to the groove metal thing that the American bands were doing. And yeah, the fact that it was picked up later on by sort of melodic, sort of metalcore bands by the mid 2000s or whatever. But we should probably talk about some bands that we like.
I do have a comment on Arch Enemy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I'd heard, I think, In Flames and a few others beforehand, but I never super got into them. But I enjoyed what I heard, those early albums with Angela Glasgow. But looking back at everything, and I think I heard even before that some of the albums with the previous vocalist, and I think a lot of those are pretty underrated, like the first 3 Arch Enemy albums. And even to the point where I think they've had sort of a side project reunion that's played in Japan because for some reason it's really popular there.
I would say they kick the crap out of something like Slaughter to the Soul. I think those are the first 3 albums. If you're going for that melodic Swedish style, then light years ahead of what At the Gates were doing.
I mean, I enjoyed all of them. At the Gates, I have sort of an interesting relationship with, but no, I mean, those early Arch Enemy albums I think are really good, and I think if you like, if you're a little hesitant with the later stuff, if you check out the really early stuff and you do like something like Carcass's Heartwork or, At the Gates or, really early Dark Tranquility, I think there's definitely something of value there in those early Arch Enemy albums. And again, it's because of just how much bigger they got with when Angela joined, that those early stuff kind of gets a little overshadowed. They don't play those songs live as much, kind of like how In Flames doesn't play anything early anymore. But yeah, not to ignore those. They're good albums.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you guys know that Arch Enemy was the first metal band ever to have a woman in the band, especially in the vocalist spot? No other metal band that had ever existed until that point had one. They were pioneers.
Well, probably none that had ever, showed up on German MTV or something.
Yeah,
possibly,
I just
I was
like
gonna say.
making that joke because of mainstream metal magazines always praising them for that, like they were.
Well, I think they
first to
said they were
figure
the
it out.
first quote unquote death metal band to do that, which is not true at all.
Nope.
Wait till these guys
Lori
hear about
Bravo.
Nuclear Death.
The inventors
Yeah,
of
Nuclear
Lori
feminism.
Bravo was doing it a long time before Arch Enemy was doing it. In
I mean,
Nuclear Death.
I'm a big Girl School fan, so we can go into
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Well, just
Or,
talking about death metal in specific, I feel like she always gets overshadowed, and sometimes the more cynical side of me of it that makes me angry in her defense is because she's not conventionally attractive by societal standards, and that's why her band isn't brought up in the discussion of pioneering bands with women as vocalists in death metal.
Well, that's probably true too. With like you look at some of the women in the early punk scene. Like I think the ones who are most remembered are the ones that people would say are pretty conventionally attractive.
Well, yeah, it's like, yeah, huge Nuclear Death fan. Obviously, you got to mention Bolt Thrower in that sentence as well. I want to be, because Angela Gosso is actually a really talented vocalist, and I need to respect that because, as I said, her voice was very formative to my getting into death metal. But I also have an edge of cynicism about what Arch Enemy did with it, because it was at the time when, I don't want to get into this territory, but it's at the time when I get you get the genre that is female fronted metal band. And it's like, that's not a genre, that's just saying the gender of the vocalist. And I guess all I'll say is just, if you're listening to this, go on Metal Archives and search Arch Enemy and look at the picture of the band and tell me whether they're doing it as a gimmick or not, and whether someone like Lori Bravo of Nuclear Death, as Tyler mentioned, might have been overlooked because they weren't of that type. Anyway, now that I've just cancelled myself,
So
let's talk about black metal for a bit. So I wanted to touch on black metal, and I wanted to touch on the legacy of Swedish death metal because I think that's quite a significant topic that we need to touch on. But we have already discussed the crossover with black metal, not just in terms of like the scene and the clientele shifting around, but also bands like Dissection. I think we should probably mention Sacramentum as well. We also, this is a deep cut for any Necropolis regulars, but on a tier list, I think it was 1994, we discussed a Dawn album, who I consider more on the black metal side. I know Tyler thinks of them as a death metal band, and stuff like Necrophobic as well that we probably need to discuss, who are in substance a death metal band, but were clearly, if not influenced, then did influence the black metal style as well. And Joseph has already brought up Marduk, and it's that proximity, I guess, to Norway in a lot of ways that brought that out. But I equally want to say there was black metal before Norway got a hold of it, i.e. Bathory, and obviously Celtic Frost, who kind of, I think their influence could be split across death metal and black metal, in that Celtic Frost were a huge influence on bands like Unleashed and Obituary as well. But you also have early black metal in terms of Profanatica and Haverhedge and Absu taking place in America, but they were always considered kind of a joke in America because death metal was so huge, and thrash for that matter as well, that black metal bands in the early 90s were just never taken seriously in the US, more or less, whereas in Scandinavia it was quite a serious thing. And we have discussed on previous episodes how all of the major players in Norway cut their teeth in death metal bands. Darkthrone started out as a death metal band. You've got Thou Shalt Suffer and Old Funeral and stuff like that. And it's no surprise that there was quite a lot of cross pollination. But yeah, like I guess we could talk about how Swedish death metal not only influenced black metal, but how it was influenced by black metal itself, and it kind of turned into. I don't want to keep talking about music that we don't like, but it turned into that generic sort of very, very mayhem influenced version of black metal when with bands like Watain and Dark Funeral and so on. I'm going to hand this out to Belisario because you haven't spoken for a bit. Have you got any thoughts on like the black metal end of the Swedish death metal scene?
Yeah, I have an opinion I want to share with you to know what you think about, but I've always thought that the Swedish scene of black metal is a bit more like brighter or more melodic than the Finnish or Norwegian counterparts. And I don't know if it's because of the influence of melodic death metal or some other influence, but usually it's catchier, it's easier to listen, even when talking about things that were kind of harsh at the time, like early Watain. And I don't mean this as a bad thing because there are good melodic things in the black metal music from Sweden, but I think in general they have this usually gentle, pleasing sound to them that you don't find in the Norwegian classics.
I think it comes back to what you were saying earlier on about how black metal presents a like holistic experience. Like essentially, by the time the Norwegian bands started getting big, anyway, I know that early black metal, Sarcophago and Bathory and Celtic Frost and stuff were still kind of rooted in that early punk thrash vibe. But by the time bands like Burzum and Emperor were honing their sound, it was very much you listen to it as a whole experience. Whereas death metal, you're still listening to the individual parts, i.e., what's the drummer doing there, what's that guitar lead there, what's that guitar tone or whatever. And I think that is still present in a band like Dissection and Sacramentum to some extent, in that it's still what I would call very riff driven. You're listening to the riffs primarily, which always struck me as like chiefly a death metal thing. Whereas, there is an atmosphere to it, but you're still intellectualizing it. You're thinking about how the riffs connect together and how the narrative is forming as a piece goes on. I'm thinking particularly about how I would listen to an album like Far Away from the Sun, whereas an album like Transylvanian Hunger or any of Burzum's first three albums is much more of like a singular experience, not ambient necessarily, but it's like a singular experience in a lot of ways. I should also, just before I hand back to you, sorry, I should also point out, listeners, that yes, we are aware that Abruptum exists, but just ignore them. They're an outlier. They're weird.
I mean, I've often said I gravitate to black metal more than death metal, despite liking quite a bit of death metal. But I think kind of when we were talking about with melody and harmony and kind of the way these play out. But I mean, like, you listen to something like De Mysterious from Mayhem, I think it has those melodic kind of riffing, the kind that like you could play a piano to it or you could kind of sing along to some of it. Like, I think it's very noticeable these days when you see Mayhem live before they play the title track. Usually the main theme is essentially played by piano and kind of a creepy tone. I think it works kind of well with it. But so it's not that surprising, I think, that, the death metal, when it does gravitate towards black metal, tends to have sort of this melodicism, very rampant in it, and then Dissection being obviously a very key figure between both scenes.
It's actually a heavy metal band, Dissection, to my understanding. Not in a bad way, but it really sounds like heavy metal.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, like, does it sound, it's a bit of black metal and death metal flavors mixed into what's essentially Number of the Beast. I mean, for me, as someone who loves Number of the Beast, I really don't have a problem with that.
I have said on this podcast before that Dissection is a fundamentally heavy metal band with a black metal aesthetic, while Sacramentum is almost the exact opposite. a fundamentally black metal band with heavy metal. I don't know if I would say the whole aesthetic is heavy metal, but definitely use of heavy metal technique.
Yeah, and they both. I mean, they come slightly later in the story of Swedish death metal or Swedish extreme metal, I guess we should say at this point. It's sort of 92, 93 that they start putting out material. So, but at this time, although the trains are on different tracks by this point as far as death metal and black metal are concerned, it's not the chaos of the 80s as Joseph alluded to earlier, but there's still quite a lot of freedom and cross-pollination going on. And again, I'd reference a band like At the Gates or even Therion to some extent, Cemetery, and Uncanny, where there's still a lot of crossover. You can do a lot with a very riff-based approach that garners a lot of flowing kind of immersive atmosphere and kind of captures that sort of naturalist majesty that black metal has. Equally, you can create a very kind of grounded, logical kind of riff-based form of death metal that's very percussive, but borrows a lot of the gothic majesty from some of the darker forms of death metal and black metal and so on. And I think that's what these bands are kind of toying with at the time. And with hindsight, we kind of struggle to categorize them because we need to within modern setting, but like at the time it was much more like free form, and people want to sort of debate endlessly the minutiae of what style they were. But and I engage with this just as much as anyone else. But I've been listening to these bands for over 20 years now, and I'm still struggling to kind of directly place them. But yeah, it's an interesting one. Sorry, Belisario, did you want to come back on any of that or?
Yes, to me, for example, the example of Necrophobic is very interesting because they had a darker take on death metal, which could have been almost genre defining, but then they just stopped at the first album and didn't continue on that path. Well, I think it's one of the best albums to come out of Swedish death metal because of it being so different and so special.
Yeah, sorry, I was just looking them up. I didn't realize it was so late on. So yeah, their first album, Nocturnal Silence, 1993. Because I do absolutely love that album. In its own right, whatever genre we're talking about here. But I always consider it more as like a very dark sort of gothic death metal album. But yeah, I didn't realize sort of afterwards. I remember listening to Dark Side and thinking it's serviceable, but it's sort of leaning into that what we sometimes probably unhelpfully refer to as Wacken metal on here, but that is like the rehomogenization of extreme metal, where by the late 90s, early 2000s, everything comes back together again, and you get loads and loads and loads of bands describing themselves as blackened death metal, which again I think
genre label.
Sorry.
I said screw that genre label.
Well, I was going to say again, I don't want to attribute any malice to Dissection, but I think they're probably the formative like example of that. But by the 2000s, it was like the industry standard for bands that play at Wacken, basically.
Yeah, they were kind of a formative influence on it, but like what came to be called black and death metal came much more to be associated with like Behemoth and Belphegor and bands that were essentially, we've talked about this before, essentially playing something that really wasn't all that different from old school death metal, not really anything like black metal at all, but because death metal had come to be so strongly associated with brutal death metal at that time, the fact that they played something not in that style, like, oh, it has a black metal influence.
Well, with the Belphegor and Behemoth, I mean, I think it's bands that, especially at least in the case of Behemoth, started as black metal and then musically very much shifted into traditional type death metal, but then kind of kept some of the black metal aesthetics, as it were. And then, depending on the band, included other influences. And of course, the other weird thing is like how oftentimes these days I see a lot of stuff that gets called Black Death, and then usually it sounds like war metal, like it's sort of blasphemy, revenge kind of thing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm sick of that as well because for me it's black metal. It's blasphemy, Impaled Nazarene, Beherit, like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a label that doesn't mean anything right now, Black Death, because
The interesting thing with labels, I mean, John from Dissection seemed frustrated with it that, like, even before the whole murder and going to jail thing, I think he started saying in interviews that Dissection was metal of death because he didn't want to be called either black metal or death metal.
Well, that in itself is a Bahira reference, isn't it? That was on Oath of Black Blood, I think.
Might have
It
been.
could be. I always see early pictures of John from Dissection wearing like Morbid Angel shirts and stuff. So I definitely feel like that's where a lot of his influences come from. Um, but I mean, if we're going to talk about genre labels and how they relate to what happened in the Swedish death metal scene, in my opinion, as much as in the modern context, you can get obsessed with all sorts of minutiae between Black Death, Blackened Death, melodic death metal, so on and so forth. If you really listen to the spirit of the genres, there is while there's obviously cross pollination, even in the most radical examples, there is a dividing line between something like, um, these are from two different countries, but dividing line between something like Dismembers like an ever-flowing stream and Gorgoroth's Antichrist, where you can tell that there's a different approach being taken.
Yeah, I mean, my way to summarize it, well, before I say that, like I get sent a lot of promos where it is this we play black and death metal or whatever. You never get deafened black metal, but anyway, and it normally means they play death metal but with more reverb and maybe some synths in the background. That's all it is. But they're essentially a death metal band. There's probably some Slayer riffs in there as well, that kind of thing. But for me, the dividing line is always that black metal does more with less, and death metal is sort of almost overcomposed in a lot of ways in that there's too much activity going on for what's being expressed, but again in a good way. And I know that I've kind of just set myself up to fail because I've drawn a line in the sand that everyone's going to say, well, what about this band? And yeah, that's true. I mean, hell, pick one odd this episode, Unleashed. They probably did more with less, but they're a death metal band. But for me, it's just, as Tyler said, it's a little bit like pornography. I can't define it, but I know it when I see it.
Since we're kind of wrapping up, I did want to ask if we're going to talk about one thing that we haven't touched on yet, which is kind of the other direction that didn't necessarily get as popular, certainly not as much as the quote-unquote melodic death metal, but like of these changes and evolutions of Swedish death metal, the path that Entombed took.
Well, I wanted to discuss the legacy of Swedish death metal in general, and I think that might feed into it because Entombed are obviously one of the biggest bands to emerge from that scene. I was going to tee it off by asking, is the Boss HM2 pedal the worst thing that ever happened to death metal in the 2000s, 2010s, and so and since 2000 basically? I'll just throw that one open. Belisario, I'm gonna ask you because I know that you do try to keep tabs on what's going on in death metal occasionally with some reviews and stuff. Do you come across a lot of bands that lean heavily on that buzzsaw guitar tone and just ape off the old school trend rather than sort of coming up with something new and imaginative, more so than, say, aping off the Floridian scene, for example?
yeah, I've come across some phenomenon of musicians from older bands getting together and forming new bands in the old Swedish style. And I think it's something quite recurrent I found in similar places, like where some guys from Demolish playing a band called Winter Wolf, which was essentially just Swedish death metal in the old way. A band from Ukraine, from the guys of Nocturna Mortum called Necrom. And there is even in Spain a band called Graveyard that are doing music in the old Swedish style. And even if one would think it's kind of a ripoff of just something too repetitive, actually it's not so bad. They managed to do something interesting out of it, which I found amazing because, as you say, many times I come across, especially in the past, bands that are supposed to resuscitate the Swedish style, and usually I didn't like them so much, like when the OSDM wave in the 2010. But sometimes you get good stuff done that way.
Yeah, I'm thinking of bands like Valenfire, which is made up of members of My Dying Bride and Paradise Lost. I don't think they exist anymore, but again, that buzzsaw tone. Darkened, who are another quote-unquote super group.
Yeah, that
Or
qualifies to what I was
yeah,
saying.
even bands like Horrendous, who have gone in a sort of weirder direction now, but they started out basically aping that style, but also incorporating a lot of that entombed element as well, because they had a lot of sort of bluesy swing to what they did. But I guess just I don't want to beat the dead horse of old school death metal trend too much, because I think it is kind of dissipating by this point, but it sort of dominated the 2010s. But the amount of bands that came out of that, newer bands, younger bands that just sort of tried to imitate that guitar tone, but also older bands like Entrails, who were an unknown Swedish band at the time. They released a couple of demos in the early 90s and then disappeared, but then they resurrected in the late 2000s as this style started to become repopularized. And they released a couple of so-so albums, but eventually it just became clear they were just kind of riding that wave of popularity and stuff. And because it is such a distinctive guitar tone, I mean, obviously I'm being provocative here. It's obviously not the worst thing that's happened to death metal, but is it the worst thing that's happened to death metal is what I'm trying to get at. Or we can just talk about the legacy of Swedish death metal in general, if anyone has any other thoughts on it.
I was just waiting to see if anybody else had any thoughts. So, yeah, I mean, like you said, the trend is largely dissipating, but I was wanting to bring up that a lot of the new wave of old school death metal took copious influences from Swedish death metal. I mean, regardless of what aesthetic they went for, whether they were going for that sort of grimy, lo-fi, early death metal approach, you know, they many of them worked in the kind of driving power chord. Uh, honestly, you guys probably covered this already. Influenced from like Swedish crust punk style, like riding rhythms of Swedish death metal, and a lot of these newer bands incorporated them into their sound. Many of them from the U.S. actually, but then also, of course, some from over in Europe as well.
I think one thing that's interesting with the legacy of the scene is that, I mentioned it earlier, one aspect of it is that, like, probably one of the earliest to kind of nostalgically look back, because these guys, were ancillary to the scene, but never really, played, weren't, they were like the younger kids. They weren't the same generation as the guys in Entombed and Dismember, but like when the Catatonia Opeth guys got together and formed Bloodbath. And the legacy of that band's sort of an interesting one. Like, I had a friend comment that, they played Maryland Death Fest last year, and there was an odd amount of people who seemed to be there for that day they played just for them and couldn't care less for any other old school death metal band that was playing, which was kind of weird since in a way they were a tribute band.
It's interesting you mentioned earlier on that, I mean, I already knew this because I have seen them live, but the dude from Paradise Lost ended up being their vocalist after, what's his face from Opeth?
Yeah, Michael Ackerfeld left. And, briefly, and that's another thing. We haven't, we never even mentioned the band Hypocrisy and how big.
They were on my list. Yeah. We did discuss them on a tier list, but yeah, obviously, first two albums, can't fault them, but it is again, much like a lot of the Swedish bands that we've been discussing, I don't necessarily want to say, oh, they fell off a cliff or whatever, even though I do think that, but it's remarkable how quickly they shifted compared to their American counterparts in, say, Deicide or Suffocation or whatever, or Incantation for that matter, who, you might think they dropped in quality by the late 90s, but they didn't shift style. They were true to death metal.
Weirdly,
whereas Swedish bands jumped all over the place.
I feel like, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could characterize it, but I think the Americans, there's sort of I don't know almost how to say it. Like there's almost sort of a kind of jockishness to American death metal, and it's not really true, but sort of a we can't go too far in this. Whereas I think a lot of European bands, especially the continental European bands, there was sort of this sort of, yeah, we'll become a goth rock band, we'll become an alt rock band, we'll become this or that, and then even throw in the death metal or black metal influence. Just the willingness to quite dramatically change.
This is always
seems ever present in anywhere from Finland to Sweden to Germany, whereas like the Americans and to some extent the British, there was changes and evolutions, but it was a little bit more methodical.
Well, you say the British, and I do concur to some extent, but again, I'll reference a band like Paradise Lost or Anathema, who really did go like this is what's always. This is probably too much of a tangent, but in Europe, the Americans have a reputation for being very, I don't want to say emotional, but just very forthright with the way they are and very unself-conscious. Basically, an American is like a British person after 7 or 8 pints, whereas Scandinavia, Germany, they have a reputation for being very, very stoic and very reserved. And it's kind of interesting that musically, they're actually off the wall. They're like very, you imagine the stereotypical stoic Scandinavian, just very reserved, very kind of not expressive or whatever, but the music they create is just, we decided to make this very, very emotional, heart-wrenching, like creative, gut-wrenching album. And then in person, they're just like, yes, we are. Hello, nice to meet you, blah, blah, blah. Whereas Americans are like, fuck yeah, we're America, but we just do the same thing over and over again, and we're not going to be from anything.
Yeah.
And there's probably an anthropological study on this, but I just find that quite an interesting phenomenon. Well, studying the metal albums that these countries released.
I mean, it's very true with like it's interesting because like much to the chagrin of someone like Albert Murderian from Decibel, because I know he's such a huge Paradise Lost and Catatonia fan, as much as those bands have gotten big in Europe, like that not really as big in the States. And I think part of that is that American metal scene has always been a little hesitant to fully embrace the or better term, the frilly shirt / gothic nature of some bands. Whereas in Europe, that's something that just seems to come in. It might be due to the fact that just the history that I think Americans in general, even our own history, we tend to be pretty removed from it in terms of where we are. Like if we see a historical monument or something, it's usually something dedicated to something that was 100, maybe 140 years ago. So it's
you don't have churches to pose in front of for your photo shoots. Yeah, that's what it is.
We essentially don't have much remnants of a pre-industrial history that just feels normal. Whereas I think in Europe, there's still so much remnants of pre-industrial Europe that still exists that it feels normal. Whereas like in America, it's like, oh, if you do that, you're being pretentious. You're acting like you're in Lord of the Rings. Like you're not doing something part of everyday life. Whereas in Europe, I think, it's like, oh yeah, there's a castle. Since I've been 5, I've walked by that place to go to school every day.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to unpack this, but I think I'm going to have to save it for another episode. But to bring it back round to our topic, I don't want to end on a negative. I think that the fact that the Swedish death metal legacy is mostly reducible to a guitar tone is really kind of a projection to some extent. Is that there are a lot of bands that do that for sure, but the early Swedish scene, particularly some of the I want to say outlier bands. They're not outliers in terms of their obscurity, just outliers in terms of the style. But the early Swedish scene was really, really adventurous when you think about bands like At the Gates, Therion, Carbonized, even bands like Catatonia were out there. And I do think there is something to be found in the first albums from Dark Tranquillity and In Flames and stuff. But unfortunately, it was kind of the legacy of just, as Tyler was saying, that riding rhythm of Entombed and Early Grave and so on that did get picked up in the 2010s. But as we mentioned and alluded to, that legacy is somewhat dissipating. And I think that as the dust settles, people will hopefully rediscover albums like Beyond Sanctorum or Gormont's The Ending Quest and so on, and just realize that there is actually a whole plethora of different interpretations of death metal going on within Sweden that are there to sort of take influence from or just develop in a lot of ways. And as we discussed, unfortunately, a lot of these bands didn't necessarily develop as much as they could because they shifted into more commercially accessible styles or just non-metal styles. And not to say that there wasn't great value in what they did, some of it anyway, but there is still kind of a lot of potential going on within that early Swedish style. So I will end with, I think Tyler's already answered this, possibly both of you as well, but I'll end with just reiterating, what is your favorite Swedish death metal album and why? And I'll reach out to Tyler first.
Dark Recollections by Carnage. It's got a summary of pretty much everything that you hear in the so-called traditional Swedish death metal sound, in a somewhat more raw and I would say kind of in-your-face format. I think that you pretty much just any kind of missteps that you would find in Entombed, and perhaps Dismember, although Dismember is pretty excellent as well. Not so big of a fan of Entombed, by the way, even the classic albums. Any of those Buzzsaw, Sunlight Studio, Boss Heavy Metal Pedal, classic Swedish death metal bands, you pretty much get all of that in Carnage. So I think that they're just a good summary of that subgenre of death metal.
Excellent and to the point, much like Dark Recollections. Belisario.
To me, that would be the Nocturnal Silence, maybe, because I've always been more of a black metal fan than death metal, but also because it represents an exploration, a move from what was actually a quite limited formula, that was early Swedish sound, and it shows it had potential to do something else, like many of the bands we discussed who made something special out of the original formula. So it means there is still a lot maybe to be done with these early genres that were in many cases abandoned quite early by the respective bands.
Yeah, totally concur with that. Joseph.
Well, I already mentioned it earlier. It would definitely be Entombed's Left Hand Path. And I kind of already, talked about that earlier. So the only thing I would say is if for whatever reason someone's listening to this and hasn't listened to that album or is going to give it a re-listen, after that, something else to check out that I think is sort of an underrated gem, I would have to recommend Gormont's The Ending Quest, just as probably the best hidden gem out of the Swedish scene.
Seconded for Gormont as well. I think that is an absolutely outstanding album. And yeah, if you've somehow got this far without listening to Left Hand Path, just switch us off and go and listen to it. But yeah, for me, I think I mentioned this earlier, I'm going to be wacky and say Therion's Beyond Sanctorum. I wanted to say Dismember because I think that frequently hits my top 5 death metal albums, but every time I hear Beyond Sanctorum, it's such a far-reaching album, both stylistically and emotively, and kind of all of the best elements of not just death metal, but sort of metal for me in terms of its escapism, but also its very sort of primal energy. So yeah. Well, thank you very much for getting through 2 hours of solid dialogue on metal. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for sticking with us as we move from the Necropolis format to Hate Meditations. As I said at the start of the episode, Necropolis will be staying on this channel, and Jason will hopefully be carrying that on, and I will be intermittently joining. And if you're new to the channel, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be hopefully delving into some more obscure topics along the way. And yeah, if you have any suggestions, please do let us know, and we'll do our best to cover what we can. And if we can't cover it, we won't cover it. So yeah, go fuck yourself.
The